Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You have reached the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig a little bit deeper. It is Thursday, December 5th, 2019, and this is episode 58.1, kicking off our 58th series of episodes with the review of the current feature, Queen and Slim. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here at the No Name Cinema Society, and I'm back in Los Angeles, and I'm back in my own apartment in Los Angeles. You may remember the last episode, I had a power outage and had to do the show from Devon's, but I'm back here with power, and I'm very excited about that. I'm power hungry right now, and so let's get straight to the intro so we can get straight to this Queen and Slim discussion. Oh, it's this way. You can see Queen and Slim is our movie for discussion tonight, and sneaking in one last show before his long hiatus, a young man who chews his food too loud, George Pappas is here with us.
That'll prove a very apt reference for tonight's discussion.
That was the goal. And also a young man who generally prefers to be alone, but he's joining us tonight. Alex Evans is here.
Hello.
Hello, Alex. Well, and I'm excited because this is the three guys that are going to be part of our Decade in Review discussion, which is going to come out in March sometime. So this is going to be when we reviewed films from 2010, 2019. So this is going to be the core of that discussion. So I'm excited about that. But tonight is all about Queen and Slim. Before that, though, I want to get to the schedule for this, our 58th series episodes, starting, of course, tonight with this review of Queen and Slim. On Monday, on December 9th, we do our Indie Spotlight, which is the sports documentary More Than a Game. And then 1 week from tonight, we do our classic movie discussion, and we're going to do the film from 1973, Bang the Drum Slowly. And on Monday, December 16th, will be our 40-second sound-off, in which Devon's going to take over the diatribe. I'm going to review a movie from the Obscure Movie Vault, and I am supposed to count down the top 5 sports documentaries of all time. So, guys, that is the 58th series of episodes. You guys aren't on any of those other episodes, but are you excited to watch?
Yes.
That'll be fun.
These guys don't normally drink with me. I've got Dogfish Head tonight, which is a Maryland-based brewery. I picked it up on a feature in Maryland last year. Do you guys? I don't suppose anybody's drinking with me tonight.
I just had a water.
Not even
You
that.
know what I'm saying by drinking. Alcohol. George, you're not.
No.
Cheers to my audience, my audience is always drinking with me. Our audience, I should say. All right, so what's up next? I think it's summary. You guys ready for summary?
Sure.
Okay.
Queen and Slim. A young black couple on their first date gets pulled over outside of Cleveland, Ohio. The cop that pulls them over is sensitive and aggressive, which leads to an altercation that results in the cop being shot to death. Acutely aware of the optics of a black couple and a dead cop, they go on the run as a video of the incident starts a social media frenzy that makes them the most hunted people in America and also heroic examples to the African-American community. Guys, how was that summary?
I thought it was apt.
Yeah. That's
priority one is to make it apt. All right, so with opening thoughts. So guys, one sentence to describe how you felt about the movie. And Alex, I'll let you go first.
I felt like it was the Public Enemy for 2019.
He's been watching a lot of old Warner Brothers movies because he works on the lot now, so that's where that reference comes from. George.
In terms of Warner Brothers movies, I think I'd go more with Bonnie and Clyde.
He hasn't gotten that far yet. He's still working on the 30s.
God, I don't know how to sum this up in one sentence. I'm sorry.
How many of you liked it or you didn't?
I did like the film.
It sounds like I might be on my own in the sense that there were moments of greatness in this film, but also tons of small things and many different disciplines that kept adding up to make this ultimately, for me, a heavy-handed disappointment.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? I agree with everything you just said. I liked the film overall, but it was up and down for me all throughout the film. I'll talk. Yeah. So I'm sorry I didn't say that more clearly before. I just don't know quite how to put into words the conflicting feelings I had all through watching it.
I feel that exact same way. And luckily we've got the rest of the half hour to get to the bottom of that. Like normally we start talking about the strongest aspect of the movie and work our way back. But I think every discipline of the movie, whether it's direction, writing, acting, has pluses and minuses. So I'm going to start with the one discipline that I think came the closest, and that's direction. The director was Melina Matsoukas, and she was very confident in many of her stylistic choices, I thought. She had a very interesting idea of playing a lot of the dialogue underneath visuals, sometimes even the faces of those actually speaking, almost as if giving the impression that they were reading each other's minds. I really liked that at first. It felt cinematic and on tone, but eventually I feel like she went to that well one or too many times, and it started to feel a little gimmicky. But overall, I really liked a lot of the style of the film. I have some other directorial things, but let's start with style.
I thought the style did a great job of capturing how it feels to interact with law enforcement in those parts of the country.
For sure. Now, my question to you, is there anything she did with the camera or something like that that captured that for you, in terms of her specific directorial choices that managed to get that?
I think the camera as a character that was always attracted to the tension. If there was something that was an object of tension within the scene, felt like the soundscape or the composition highlighted that rather than just being on the face of a character in a more traditional coverage.
Okay. And you mentioned tone earlier, and that was my next thing. But before I get to tone, I want to give George a chance to opine about style.
Couple of things. I think she sought an almost diffused style for a lot of the film. So she didn't it was not one moment rapidly followed by another escalating tension moment after another, which to some extent may have blunted some of the impact of the film. But overall, I think we were in the reality that they were experiencing, not knowing what was coming next, and having their moments together, encountering the strangeness of being in that position and interacting with other people. That may have gave us a "you are there" kind of feeling, which overall was good for the film. Also, I think the movie's very well shot. The different places that they are in, the different times of day, the way things feel, whether they're in an urban landscape or in a rural area, there was just a sense of a lot going on that I really appreciated.
Yeah, and you hit on, Alex talked about tone, and you talked about cinematography, which I both had coming up. There's my next two things. And I think what you were heading, in terms of the editing, I think you were sort of talking about the tone as well, which I found really lyrical at times, especially when it was more focused on character than plot, as in character development. I think constantly tonight I'm going to say, but, I really like this, but then, the tone also gets a little didactic and heavy-handed at other times, detracting from the overall power for me. Fans of the show know that I'm pretty sensitive to that. And in terms of the cinematography that you brought up, George, I was starting to think throughout the movie that it was one of the best looking films I've seen this year. I love the look of the film, the lighting, the texture, the shot choices, the depth of many of the frames. But then there was like an occasional shot in there that I didn't like, and it would be striking to me because the rest of it was so on point. And it was usually the shots that felt like too much or heavy-handed. And I also didn't like when she was playing with focus as an idea. It was frequently too on the nose. Alex is our resident cinematographer, so I'm curious what he has to say about that.
I really enjoyed the interplay between light of a lot of creative color palettes that felt organic to the environments.
That's a great point, yeah.
The production design, along with the location scouting, really helped make those things sing. And I would say the work of the gaffer, makeup artist, and DP really made all the skin tones look really great throughout. And you had people of all different melanin levels. If you have darker skinned leads, it can cause some cinematographers to overlight. And I felt like this one, people looked like themselves and
I noticed
like
that
the
too.
characters.
That was one of the reasons why I think I was feeling it was a well-shot movie. But then they did some things that felt really gimmicky to me, like when they were playing with soft focus in some spots that really bumped for me. So I really mostly like the cinematography.
I actually loved the way Alex just described the color palettes and how they reflected what that. Also, I was struck right from the first scene. They were so dark. It's never really occurred to me that anyone lights black actors differently.
Oh yeah,
it really looked like people that you see that
The car rigging, there's 5 different cars that are heavily featured in this film. It worked really well in finding shots that told the story well rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Except there was that one moment when the car wasn't driving. They were parking, I think, by a horse farm.
Oh, and the door closes and it shakes.
And not only that, but you can feel, the camera's rigged to the car. You know what I mean? You can feel that because they open and close the camera, essentially. That's one of those gimmicky moments that bumped for me. And it was one of those things that it's cinematography was going so well. And why are they doing this? It takes me out of it. It felt sloppy. I'm glad you brought that up because that reminded me of another example. George, are you good to move on to? Can I move on to score? You have more. Okay, so the score, I really thought it was similarly. I thought the score was beautifully moody and on tone. until it wasn't. Again with the butts. Usually when things got tense and suspenseful, different instrumentation was used, and it felt like it was in a totally different movie. And I feel like the composer wants to have different differentiation, but it wants to also feel like the score is all part of a whole. I mean, Patrick, a member of the society, suggests that if the score isn't working, if I'm noticing it, but I think that's, for me, has part to do with me being aware that I have to review the film, so me feeling like I need to be hyper aware of all the different elements. So I don't know if that's as much of a problem. But guys, did anybody notice the score or know what I'm talking about?
I did. You go first. Sorry.
I felt like it was kind of jumping between some classic soul feeling stuff and then very like discordant, like Hans Zimmer, Philip Glass, experimental, just building soundscapes as opposed to traditional like operatic motifs.
The 3/4 of the time, I thought the scoring was excellent. And then other times it did call attention to itself, and it almost seemed to be commenting in a weird way on what was going on. I may have noticed the negatives more because most of the time I thought the scoring was so good. The scoring was uneven, I thought, in this film.
As I was working on preparing for tonight, every element I was like, I really like this, but then these aspects I didn't. So everything is sort of a mixed bag, including the editing, because obviously the editing is part of what made the mood work as often as it did. But then there were several scenes in which they crossed the line, which is famously a pet peeve of mine. It's distracting and doesn't add anything, and it feels like a leftover of the director's music video career. Daniel Kaluuya has this beautiful monologue in the middle of the movie, which was begging to be one shot, but then they cut it all up. And that's just in-scene editing. In terms of overall editing, I felt like it was a little long, taking extra time to making sure we really understood all of the film's points. And also, I feel like we never should have left the perspectives of the two main characters. It was pretty infrequent that we would leave them. And when it was done, felt like it was a sidetrack and the film lost momentum. Constantly we're cutting back and forth between the chasees and the chasers. It would have been one thing. This film mostly stays with the protagonist. When we cut away from the protagonist, that occasional time, again, it doesn't feel on brand for this movie. It feels like discordant tone.
Yeah, there's one enormous scene that does that very thing, the rally.
Yeah,
it should have been a very impactful scene, or why have it there? And it ended up just seeming like a distraction.
They also have something very specific they wanted to do by cross-cutting that with the love scene, and I'm not sure exactly what the intent was. Like, it wasn't clear to me how to interpret that.
It didn't really have much of an effect. I thought it was just distracting, honestly. They should have left the love scene alone. I don't know that rally scene needed to happen. I know that you're asked to see the impact of how young African-American boys are reacting to what they're seeing around them. But I still thought it fell flat.
I wonder what it would have been like if we had just heard about what happened.
Or they had heard about it.
When they heard about what happened.
Woke them up to the effects of what they were doing. That might have been incredibly impactful.
That was my theory as well. I feel like if I had heard about it when they heard about it, and like it would have been that gut punch, like that gut punch you feel in Mrs. Miniver when you learn about the flower guy's death at the end. Alex, anything on the editing?
I actually really enjoyed the demonstration scene intercut with the love scene. I felt like the two other parts of the film that tied that together was when Slim gives the monologue about asking all his family members where babies come from.
The monologue that I didn't like that it was cut up, but yeah.
Sure. And the one about taking the photograph together. That it was a matter of not apologizing for existing and not being afraid to be seen.
Do you feel like the love scene intercut with the rally added to that?
I did.
Jordan, sounds like you don't necessarily feel the same way. You're with me on it. Like, I feel like it didn't necessarily achieve that.
It seemed to belabor something. You were being taken away from the main focus. Maybe the goal was to show them as people who were actually not aggressive people, in spite of what was going on in the environment around them. It's the world around them that is violent, that is hostile.
Making a point they had already made throughout the previous 90 minutes of the movie. So, all right, moving on to performances, which I feel like similarly range from outstanding to not so good. And so let's start with Daniel Kaluuya, who I think was even better here than he was in Get Out. His choices were detailed and honest. His character felt very real and dimensional to me, very expressive in silences with subtext during his dialogue.
I've enjoyed seeing his evolution. It's great seeing him go into horror and now into more and more serious genre and drama films.
Yeah, I thought he was really good. George, Daniel Kaluuya?
I loved him in this film. often just watching him listen and taking in what was going on.
Yes, I'd originally written that down, and I'm like, oh, I need to shorten this up. I had written down listening as well, so I'm glad you mentioned it.
Very easy to empathize with.
Yeah. Now the flip side, and we'll see if I get in trouble in this. Apparent newcomer Jodie Turner-Smith did not seem to convey any convincing emotion to me. She almost seemed hollow inside. I wasn't getting any sense of depth from her. She talked about her backstory, but I didn't feel it from her in the same way that I did from Kaluuya, or the effect that it had on her. It's fine to underplay things, of course, but it's not the same thing as not playing anything at all. Unfortunately, she seemed out of place and lost, and this was a downside for me. I really wasn't buying her. Alex?
I was really compelled by her performance, and she felt like a lot of people that I know like the only small glimpses into her vulnerability and how big of a wall she'd built around herself. The whole thing is just both of them tearing those walls down.
I understand the script intentions, but I actually don't think she executed it. George, break the tie.
I thought the script actually gave her a lot of challenges that I don't think anyone would have had an easy time pulling off. The reality,
but it's your job. You know what I mean? Like, it's your job.
It is. I think she had moments that were very touching and very effective, and other times I felt, to contrast her with Daniel, I felt that the changes his character went through, he really went through. We watched him toughen up a bit, but he was the same person growing from experience. I didn't see the through line with her. I didn't see her going from place to place to place and believe it was all happening to the same person, so much as it was an actor playing scenes that required different things of that actor.
I almost didn't buy her as a three-dimensional character, and so I have stronger feelings about the performance. So, but it does make sense, George, and but I also want to take this with my 10 seconds left on performances. I do want to recognize Bokeem Woodbine, who I feel like steals every scene he's in.
He's outstanding. I agree with you about that.
His portrayal was so thorough. You knew him immediately. He almost seemed to transcend the script. The role was probably too small for Oscar consideration, but it was the best work that I've seen from him. George already agreed. Alex?
I thought he was great and really did make that role sing and make it bigger than it seemed like it would have been on the page.
Yeah, I mean, those are my favorite scenes in the movie, I think, when they were visiting him.
In a screenplay where everything has to be so black and white, he found a way to play someone who has a lot of unlikable characteristics in a way that still charmed you to him.
Great point. All right, so moving on to the screenplay. Similarly, mixed feelings. Overall, though, I would say this is the weakest element for me because it reminded me of a student film type script. Naive and broad that makes its points with blunt instruments. I really, really like the story and the concept. The premise is strong and interesting. It's the story execution that I question. So I want to start with structure. And I often say, and it came up just the other night with Alex at a party. He and I were talking about how the screenwriter's goal is to hide the structure, which I think this film fails to do. I was always aware of the screenwriter's hand manipulating events. I was always aware of the plot points, and thus it feels less organic. So it becomes more about the point that the screenwriter is trying to make, instead of about the story and the characters. And also, I feel like the dialogue was frequently on the nose, lacking in subtext, especially for the two main characters. And worst of all, they didn't seem to have distinct voices, which is a common issue for young and experienced screenwriters. I feel like these characters sounded the same to each other. So really, they're just mouthpieces for the author. Instead of, another goal, as Alex will also tell you, if you're screenwriters, to make your characters sound different from one another so they feel distinct. But in terms of like the words that they said, they sounded very similar to one another. So, a lot of like rookie almost screenplay mistakes. And I know Lena Waithe was a TV writer for a long time, but this feels very naive and young to me to some degree. Alex, what do you think?
I felt it was very novelistic, and it felt like these are just incarnations of Waithe's viewpoint as kind of the circumstance, because it felt like a story about bad circumstances where character choice doesn't really change because the whole story is driven by fate. I thought for the story that it was telling, it worked, but I think in terms of having like a staying power of a film that you'll go back to over and over again for years, that rigidity in the dialogue did make it a little cold.
It's not a character-driven film, really. It's not a plot-driven film. It's an event-driven film. The characters suffered based on that. I agree that the writing was probably the main reason we're finding things uneven in the film. While the premise is great and does pull you in and keep you wanting more, where it comes up short because the writing isn't as good. Even in that great, it's a great scene, when they get stopped and the disaster unfolds. But The cop is so brutal right off the bat. It doesn't even escalate. It's almost like they're thrust into this terrible situation. I would like to have seen something complex bring about what happened.
You want shades too, but I mean, at the same time, like that's not. I don't have her experience. You know what I mean? So it's hard. Before we came on air, Alex made the joke. All right, 3 European Americans talking about this movie. I see his point, so I can't speak to how realistic that first scene is or not.
All I can say is that I don't mean to contrast it to another film, but I remember seeing Fruitvale Station. Everything that went wrong in that, there were multiple elements leading up to whatever happened to anyone.
And even something hopefully like Crash at least has those shades.
It makes it more dramatically satisfying than this particular film. I think the lack of what's satisfying is in the screenplay to me, not in the direction or other elements as much as in the screenplay.
I thought the police officer scene was dead on, and it really felt like the energy I felt from dealing with law enforcement in a lot of places in the country. I'm not saying every law enforcement officer I've ever encountered, but the bulk of them.
I had to just trust what the screenwriter was telling me. I agree, George, there weren't shades, and so from a dramatic point of view, it was disappointing. I also didn't understand his switch. Like he's being officious at first, and then later you find out he has a history of racism. His turn, I missed it completely, and I was confused, but I sort of went with it because it was early in the movie. All right, guys, it's time to move on to the next section, and we call it the T word, in which we talk about themes. Obviously, the movie has a very strong perspective on race. The film paints a bleak picture of how uncomfortable life still is for Black America. The actions of one racist unleashes a tempest which reveals the racism present in many others. The film reminds us that hate begets hate begets hate. And that hate is based on fear, and it seems to be an endless cycle of misunderstanding, lack of communication that we as a culture can't seem to break. The film mostly paints this picture with a broad brush, as we've been saying, or at least I've been saying, which tends to make me bristle. But there are those that argue that that's necessary. I don't know if anybody's going to argue necessarily that this film's central theme is race and the racial divide.
That is what its central theme is, and how alienated from the law the majority of an entire race feels in this particular nation and always has.
I felt like it was a film about the relationship between the state and the people, more than it was about just race.
Can you expand?
Something that the female lead's character says a lot of things, like when she's going into her kind of attorney speak, is talking about, like, if you get arrested, you become the state's property and all this. It seemed a little reminiscent of the film Brazil that we reviewed on here a while back. So that there is this authoritarian organization that perpetuates its power through state violence that all you can do is run from. And it really created like a dystopian post-apocalyptic film, but it is modern.
One film that I never thought would come up tonight would be Brazil, but I see your point. I never would have made that connection myself. Anything to say about that, George?
Not really. I can't argue it. I see your point.
I think the dystopian picture is still related to the racial divide, because I mean,
sure, I think that's the entry point of the story. But I'll also say I think the police officer, his character didn't come off as being ideologically racist, as opposed to just being individually culturally insensitive and ignorant.
But I mean, I think that's modern day racism.
Yeah.
For the most part, the hardcore racists, the Klan and all those people are much less present than they were. The modern day racism theoretically is more subtle.
If your job is to protect and serve and perpetuate what the status quo of perceived peace is, and that peace within the community where you are issued a badge is based on a hierarchical class structure, then your job becomes to uphold that structure.
Well, I also look at it as a little more nuanced than that even too, because I mean, like, my dad was a cop. I wasn't on the job with him. I mean, he never seemed like a racist to me. The racial profiling is almost natural to them based on what they learned, and it is hard for them, unfortunately, to unlearn it.
A lot of that comes into at the state legislature level, these strategies that are used for recruiting people to become deputies. Is selecting people that are going to be more malleable, but also will fall into some of these pockets of ignorance or certain bits of cultural preconception and bias.
Are you suggesting that someone out there is purposefully hiring people that are prone to racism?
Yes. For instance, it was shown during the Rodney King incidents in the 90s that the LAPD was specifically recruiting European American men from the South, like Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, to come be law enforcement officers in South Central Los Angeles with the thought that they'll have no connection to or gang affiliation, so they're able to be more unbiased. But the result it yielded was very much the opposite and exacerbated the problems.
I mean, I can't corroborate that. I mean, I'd like to see that documentation, because that doesn't sound right to me. But I mean, like, I just think that it's a sort of endless cycle. It's culture created, but it's created by 400 years of fear, unsubstantiated fear. But I mean, like, it's fear of the other, fear of the unknown. You know what I mean? Like, fear of something different, and that is perpetuated itself over, you know, at least 300 years.
There's guilt factoring into that too.
Certainly now, yeah.
It goes back to the birth of the country, that the British Army liberated 30,000 African-American men from bondage, put guns in their hand to fight against the American cause. So that fear of the Southern ruling class of what armed Black people can do has existed for the entire history of our country.
I'm sure that's true. But you know, it's a sort of endless cycle is my point. The other theme that I brought from the film is community. I feel like the film seems to be a call for the Black community to stand together, if not against white America, at least against racists as much as possible. It's difficult enough to deal with the circle of hate from a large part of the country that they can't afford to turn on each other. They're in this together. It's unfortunate that it's necessary, but until we as a culture learn to listen and be compassionate, the divide will have to stand. I don't think the film is really condoning a more militaristic or revolutionary approach, but I can see how the film can be interpreted that way. So I'm curious how you guys took it.
I thought it was decrying the militaristic aspects of the way in which we run the American state and our individual states and municipal governments, with state violence as our means of law enforcement.
Do you think it was making any recommendations for the African-American community and how to resolve that?
I think it was trying to start conversations, and I appreciated that they had different characters that felt differently about what they were doing and perceived what they were doing differently within different Black communities across like the American Midwest and South. It wasn't about one person's right or wrong, but just these are all questions to explore and how complex the issues around this topic is.
I didn't think it was making a statement about the system at large the way Alex seems to have. I think it really was talking about the divide between law enforcement and the African-American community. It doesn't say that every Black person is on the side of every Black person and that every danger faced by a Black person comes to them from a white person. It is a suspicion between one side of the law and the other. I did find that very haunting. It is something that I think people need to look into more.
Add to your point, George, there's Black characters in the film that are not with our characters. That's why it made me think about community in the sense, like, don't be against these guys. You know, like, these guys were victims of a system. You know, we need to support them. All right, it is time to close things out. Our next current feature will be at the end of December. We're going to do our annual Star Wars movie, The Rise of Skywalker, and supposedly Alex will be back for that if we can work out our schedules. And that'll supposedly air Thursday, December 26th, 2019, 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Pacific. But before that, we continue our 58 series of episodes this Monday, December 9th. And I'll be back in your apartment, George, in Queens for our Indie Spotlight, because you're going on a little hiatus. So I'm going to be back in George's apartment when I'm in New York. And I'm going to review the film More Than a Game, which is an indie documentary. That'll be your Indie Spotlight. And until then, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.
Thanks for watching.
Hi, y'all. Thank you.